The whole of government is responsible. The hearings that followed the OPM breach were strongly reminiscent of the investigation of the South Carolina Department of Revenue breach in their narrow focus on encryption and two-factor authentication, as well as their frequent invocations of government security standards and the responsibility of other government agencies to determine and enforce appropriate data protection controls. For instance, when Archuleta was questioned by the House Oversight Committee at a hearing on June 16, 2015, she was asked repeatedly by members of the committee why OPM had failed to encrypt the stolen data. In her responses, she pointed out, correctly, that encryption would have been unlikely to block an intrusion that, like Deep Panda's, relied on the use of stolen credentials. But she also attempted to deflect blame for the decision onto the Department of Homeland Security, the government agency responsible for civilian cybersecurity efforts, implying that it was not, or should not have been, her decision what security standards to implement at OPM. In a tense back and forth with Committee Chair Representative Jason Chaffetz, Archuleta blamed everyone and everything, from DHS to the age of OPM's IT systems, for the lack of encryption. Chaffetz: why wasn't this information encrypted? Archuleta: the encryption is one of the many tools that systems can use. I will look to my colleagues at DHS for their response. Chaffetz: no, I want to know from you why the information wasn't encrypted. This is personal sensitive information. Birth dates, social security numbers, background information, addresses. Why wasn't it encrypted? Archuleta: an adversary possessing proper credentials can often decrypt data. It is not feasible to implement on networks that are too old. Later, during the hearing, when the same question was put to DHS, the agency that Archuleta was eager to hold responsible for OPM's security posture, Andy Osmond, the DHS Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications, reiterated the same point, saying, if an adversary has the credentials of a user on the network, then they can access data even if it is encrypted. Just as the users on the network have to access data, and that did occur in this case, so encryption in this instance would not have protected this data. As with the SCDOR incident, and so many other security breach post-mortems, these after-the-fact accusations of negligence are largely valid criticisms of the victim's security posture, but also largely irrelevant to the breach in question. OPM probably should have been encrypting more of its sensitive data, but it's also true that encryption would have been unlikely to prevent this particular breach, since the intruders had access to valid credentials. Similarly, the Oversight Committee's claim that OPM could have significantly delayed or mitigated the 2015 breach and locked out attackers by implementing two-factor authentication procedures for all employees assumes that the intruders had no way to intercept a second authentication factor, in addition to a password. This claim seems especially misguided in light of the fact that, according to U.S. CERT's report on the incident, the initial installation of PlugX was carried out using a Keypoint employee's multi-factor credentials that included both a password and a temporary code provided by a security token. Keypoint disputed this conclusion and maintained that no unaccounted security tokens were used at the time of the breach. Archuleta's appeals to DHS to justify the security mechanisms that were and were not in place at OPM also recalls the back and forth between South Carolina's governor and the IRS in the wake of the SCDOR breach, with one government agency accusing another of failing to set appropriate security requirements and standards. In her testimony, Archuleta pointed to DHS as responsible for OPM's decision about whether or not to encrypt data. But that was not the only explanation OPM offered for how its security posture had been shaped and hindered by government-issued recommendations. Soon after the agency was made aware of the first breach in March 2014, OPM Director of IT Security Operations Jeff Wagner had recommended that OPM purchase Cylance Protect, one of the tools that was ultimately used to detect and remediate the malware used in the later breach. But OPM failed to carry out this recommendation, instead opting to purchase a less thorough security screening tool because Cylance Protect had not yet been certified by the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, FedRAMP, mandated by the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, for government agencies procuring cloud-based technologies. In a perfect world, we would have deployed Cylance Protect earlier. But because we were trying not to break rules and trying to live within structures, we didn't deploy it, Wagner told Congress. Wagner's and Archuleta's attempts to deflect responsibility for OPM's security decisions to DHS and OMB hinted the complexity and confusion around government-issued security recommendations and requirements, but also belie OPM's seeming ambivalence to those recommendations and security in general in the years leading up to the breach. OPM, after all, had repeatedly failed to address concerns raised by FISMA audits going back as far as 2007, and was operating nearly a quarter of its IT systems without a valid security authorization from the Inspector General. Furthermore, when OPM finally did decide to purchase Cylance Protect on June 30, 2015, more than a year after Wagner initially recommended it, the product had still not been certified as FedRAMP compliant. In other words, OPM appeared to follow the recommendations of other government branches with regards to computer security only very intermittently, and not as part of a broader commitment to trying not to break rules or live within structures. The agency's top priority prior to the breach appears to have been not letting security audits or updates interfere in any way with their day-to-day operations. When asked by Chaffetz why she didn't shut down the systems without proper security authorizations, Archuleta replied obliquely, "To shut down the system, we need to consider all of the responsibilities we have with the use of our systems. As the director of OPM, I have to take into consideration all of the work that we must do." Even after the full extent of the breach began to come to light, forcing OPM to deploy Cylance Protect and shut down most of its systems, the agency continued to prioritize making sure that some of its services, including the USA Jobs website, were not interrupted over the remediation of its compromised network. That OPM was able to continually ignore the poor FISMA audits and failed security assessments indicates just how much autonomy the agency had to make independent security decisions, and also how little importance it attached to those decisions. During the congressional hearings, Georgia Representative Jody Heiss asked Seymour if her office imposed any consequences for the operators of the OPM systems who continue to run their computer systems without proper security authorizations from the Inspector General. Seymour responded, "The consequences that we have are we report to OBM on a quarterly basis about the status of our security and our network." Heiss replied, "That doesn't sound like consequences. That sounds like just reporting that you are required to do anyway." The fundamental failing of OPM's leadership was not in their slowness to implement encryption or two-factor authentication, much less in their diligent adherence to arcane or out-of-date government security standards. Those were merely symptoms of a broader determination on the part of the agency to ignore or minimize any and all warning signs of potential threats and insecure systems for as long as possible, and encourage similar behavior at all levels across the agency by failing to create any incentives for OPM employees or IT administrators to take action when security concerns were flagged by audits or outside contractors. Even as she deflected blame for security decisions to other government agencies, Archuleta still attempted to frame the detection of the breach as a victory for OPM and herself, despite the fact that they had ignored several warning signs in the months leading up to the largest exfiltration efforts and chosen to monitor the situation for months rather than taking prompt action to remove the identified threats. Pressed on why she failed to act on all the recommendations put forth during FISMA audits, Archuleta told Chaffetz, "It was as a result of our security systems that we were able to detect this intrusion." She took credit for the Inspector General's determination that OPM's IT security posture exhibited a significant deficiency in 2014, a modest improvement over its classification of demonstrating material weakness in previous years. Archuleta contended that she and Seymour had been making great strides towards securing the OPM systems. They just hadn't had enough time to undo all the damage that had already been done when they arrived at the agency in 2013. "If there is anyone to blame, it is the perpetrators," Archuleta told a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee. Far from accepting responsibility for the breach, Archuleta was determined to cast blame on anyone else, including her predecessors and other government bodies, and paint herself as not only blameless, but actually the savior of OPM's systems, as in the following exchange with Chaffetz. Archuleta: "I would note that in the IG's report that he acknowledges the fact that we have taken important steps in reforming our IT systems. Advanced tools take time." Chaffetz: "So what kind of grade would you give yourself? Are you succeeding or failing?" Archuleta: "Cybersecurity problems take decades." Chaffetz: "We don't have decades. They don't take decades." Archuleta: "I'm sorry. Cybersecurity problems are decades in the making. The whole of government is responsible, and it will take all of us to solve the issue and continue to work on them. My leadership with OPM is one that instigated the improvements and changes that recognized the attack." Oklahoma Representative Steve Russell later mocked Archuleta's claim that without her system upgrades, the attack would never have been detected. "That is tantamount to saying if we had not watered our flower beds, we would have never seen the muddy footprints on the open windowsill," he told her. Remediation of political espionage. How intruders will use stolen data depends entirely on their larger motivation, whether they're driven by financial gain, espionage, or a desire to publicly humiliate their victims. But the mitigations and responses undertaken by breached organizations in the aftermath of these incidents are almost identical, regardless of the suspected motivation. At the time of the breach, OPM had no established policy or standards about offering identity theft protection services to individuals whose data was leaked or stolen. Operating under time pressure, OPM ultimately decided to follow the same template that many companies used in the aftermath of data breaches. When the Government Accountability Office, GAO, later reviewed OPM's decision-making process, they found that OPM officials were unable to provide any records concerning how or why they decided on the identity protection services offered to breach victims. OPM officials said that the decisions were not documented because they were made during a crisis, under intense pressure, and were principally the subject of oral discussions during meetings. The only document OPM was able to turn up was a list of other organizations' responses to past breaches that might have been consulted at the time. So it should come as no surprise that the aftermath of the OPM breach closely resembled the aftermath of the financially motivated data breaches at TJX and the South Carolina Department of Revenue. In the months that followed the public announcement of the OPM breach, the government estimated that the costs of providing identity monitoring and protection services to the victims would total $500 million and require contracting several different firms to provide the necessary amount of coverage. The Government Accountability Office found that the agency ended up spending only $240 million on just 2 contracts for identity monitoring, one with the Winvale Group and another with Identity Theft Guard Solutions, LLC, and, in doing so, ended up purchasing duplicate protection for roughly 3.6 million people affected by both of its 2015 breaches. But while the U.S. government offered many of the same identity theft insurance and restoration services provided to victims of financially motivated breaches, including credit monitoring and identity theft insurance, these mitigations were less significant in the wake of a breach that was not designed to commit fraud. Initially, the government announced it would offer identity protection services through December 2016 to individuals whose personnel records were stolen, and through December 2018 for those whose background investigation records were stolen. In late 2015, President Obama extended the identity protection services for both groups to last 10 years, and the 2016 Consolidated Appropriations Act also required that the coverage last at least a decade. But the extension, though it seemed to acknowledge the enduring nature of the stolen data, did little to address concerns about targeting from foreign governments. Moreover, the expanded protections OPM was required to offer after the passage of the Consolidated Appropriations Act were not always very meaningful. For instance, prior to the Act's passage, the agency had offered breach victims up to $1 million each in identity theft insurance coverage, until the Act forced them to increase that limit to $5 million. The identity monitoring firms with whom OPM had contracted raised the limit of each victim's insurance coverage to $5 million from the initially agreed-upon $1 million without demanding any additional payment from the government, because they knew the allowable claims would be so small that they would never approach even $1 million, much less $5 million. The GAO, assessing OPM's response to the breach, later concluded that the high dollar amount of the required insurance coverage might give consumers the impression that the insurance coverage is broad, when the scope of items covered by identity theft insurance is generally limited to out-of-pocket expenses that are typically modest. Federal employees and their unions filed 2 lawsuits against OPM and its contractors following the breach. The American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, filed a class action suit against OPM, Archuleta, Seymour, and Keypoint in June 2015, and the National Treasury Employees Union, NTEU, filed another complaint the following month. Both complaints alleged negligence on the part of OPM, with the AFGE suit stating that the agency willfully, intentionally, and with flagrant disregard refused to take steps to implement security safeguards. The NTEU complaint was filed after Archuleta's resignation, and therefore named her successor, Beth Cobert, citing the director's reckless indifference to her obligation to protect the personal information of current and former federal employees. But, as in the case of the SCDOR breach victims, the AFGE and NTEU plaintiffs faced considerable difficulties in trying to establish standing to sue in cases where they could not link the breach to clear financial losses. OPM took advantage of this in their August 2016 motion to dismiss the class action suits, arguing that mere allegations of identity theft, untethered to this particular cyber intrusion, cannot establish the requisite harm necessary to obtain money damages or injunctive relief, and that the instances of financial fraud cited by the plaintiffs were not fairly traceable to the OPM breach in particular. Ultimately, the real value of the stolen background investigations and personnel files to a foreign government was unlikely to be financial. Foreign officials were probably not going to open up bank accounts or claim tax returns for federal employees. But financial harms were what OPM provided protections against, simply because those were the typical protections to provide in the wake of a breach. The OPM breach highlights the limitations of existing mitigations for espionage breaches and the extent to which they mirror the same steps taken in the aftermath of financial breaches, despite the very different motivations of the perpetrators involved. Making stolen information less valuable to foreign governments as a political tool is much more difficult than making stolen information less valuable to fraudsters, and requires much more extreme and onerous steps, such as the U.S. decision to pull spies from China and CIA operatives out of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, for fear their covers might have been blown by information stolen during the breach. Effective remediation to contain the harm caused by data breaches depends on the victims being able to control the value and spread of data even after it has been exfiltrated and is no longer in their sole possession. In political espionage cases like the OPM breach, where access to the stolen data is itself the end goal, there is very little that can be done by way of remediation after that data is exfiltrated. This is more often true of espionage incidents than financially motivated breaches, where there are often monetization stages of an attack that can be interrupted even after data is stolen. But the OPM breach is more extreme in this regard than the DigiNotar compromise, where the certificate security compromise was a means to reading other people's email, or even the PLA Unit 61398 breaches, where the stolen data was a means to manipulate trade disputes and manufacture products using proprietary intellectual property. Each of those incidents had later stages that defenders could hope to interfere with, whether by using browser security mechanisms to identify fraudulent certificates, or legislation and economic policies to penalize companies suspected of intellectual property theft. In the case of the OPM breach, however, exfiltration of the agency's information essentially was the final stage of the breach, making it appropriate, and indeed necessary, to focus on defenses that allowed the breach to progress to that point. Following the data exfiltration from OPM, the perpetrators did not have to rely on any subsequent financial gain or transmission of their stolen information to a wider audience. So at that point, the only potential further remediation required making personnel changes that would render the stolen data inaccurate and obsolete. The purely political espionage motivation behind the OPM breach, as opposed to the economic drivers for the data thefts perpetrated by PLA Unit 61398, was notable not just because it changed the available options for after-the-fact remediation, but also because the U.S. government had implicitly endorsed political espionage when it filed the indictment against PLA Unit 61398 officers in 2014. At the time, the United States faced international criticism for accusing a foreign government of espionage activities that, to many, closely resembled the United States' own spying operations. The Department of Justice maintained that there was an important distinction between political espionage, conducted for the purposes of national security, and economic espionage, conducted for the purposes of commercial benefit and private sector enrichment. This distinction is not always clear-cut, especially in countries with major state-owned businesses, but the United States government clung to it in the aftermath of the PLA Unit 61398 espionage efforts. So the OPM breach espionage, which appeared to be purely political in nature, was in many ways more difficult for the United States to respond to than the private sector breaches by PLA Unit 61398. This was not just because the OPM breach revealed far more data, affecting millions more people, but also because it was a type of espionage that the U.S. had itself seemingly endorsed just a year earlier, without any apparent ability to defend itself against such efforts. The OPM breach gave rise to a series of conflicts between different government agencies, between government employees and their employer, and between government agencies and their private industry contractors, all of which called into question government agencies' ability and willingness to take a leadership role on issues related to cybersecurity. OPM's eagerness to cast blame on Keypoint for the initial intrusion, as well as Archuletta's claim that it was she, rather than Cylance or Cytec, who was responsible for the breach's detection, did little to foster strong cooperation between the public and private stakeholders involved in the incident. Many firms were already skeptical of the expertise and technical skills of policymakers in this area, a bias that the OPM breach not only confirmed, but also worsened, by demonstrating how, beyond just a lack of technical expertise, policymakers had additionally not attempted to set much of an example for incident reporting, analysis, transparency, and consumer protection in the aftermath of major breaches. As a very public and embarrassing security failing, the OPM breach and its fallout cemented the challenges policymakers faced in trying to influence industry stakeholders or impose clearer liability regimes. Meanwhile, the bitter infighting and race to assign blame among government actors in the wake of the OPM breach paralleled similar fights among private stakeholders involved in other breaches, reinforcing the notion that placing blame and assigning responsibility to someone else, even within the government itself, is always everyone's primary focus in the aftermath of a security incident, regardless of what is at stake and who the victim is. The espionage incidents involving DigiNotar, PLA Unit 61398, and OPM highlight both important similarities and key differences between trying to defend against spying versus financial crimes. From a strictly technical perspective, there is no clear difference between the kinds of vulnerabilities and techniques that enable intruders to access protected computer systems for espionage and financial fraud. Phishing emails, malware, and stolen credentials recur across incidents motivated by both financial gain and espionage. On the one hand, this is good news for defenders. Security controls targeting these technical stages common to all types of security incidents can have far-reaching impacts, providing protection against more than just one type of crime. But these technical stages, though they recur over and over again, are also often the least essential, most easily replaceable steps for intruders when it comes to carrying out their ultimate goals. The essential bottleneck stages of security breaches, the ones that intruders absolutely must carry out in order to be successful, usually occur toward the end of an incident's life cycle when the perpetrators are ready to execute their end goal, whether that is monetization or access to secret information or something else entirely. And when it comes to mitigating those final stages, there are simply many more bottleneck opportunities for interrupting financially motivated cybercrimes, especially those that rely on centralized financial intermediaries, than there are for defending against the exfiltration of stolen data from compromised computer systems for espionage purposes. Financially motivated breaches like the ones directed at TJX and SCDOR have only just begun at the moment when stolen data is retrieved from a breached organization's systems. That data still has to be successfully sold and used, and the money from those sales has to be transmitted back to the perpetrators before their work is done. Not so for espionage incidents like the breach of OPM and the PLA Unit 61398 efforts. In such cases, the last real opportunity for defensive intervention comes at the moment of data exfiltration, so there are fewer bottleneck stages for defenders to try to cut off. After exfiltration, the targeted governments can file indictments, change the terms of international trade, relocate overseas spies, and offer identity protection services, but to a large extent the harm has already been done. The CryptoLocker and DigiNotar cases are both interesting examples of deviations from that pattern in ways that make them, respectively, harder and easier to mitigate than other incidents perpetrated for similar reasons. By relying on cryptocurrency payments and selling data directly back to its original owners, CryptoLocker eliminated centralized financial intermediaries and black market forums that law enforcement routinely relied on to help police financial cybercrimes. Because of this, CryptoLocker, and ransomware more generally, proved impervious to many of the traditional models of dealing with financially motivated cybercrimes, for the same reason that espionage incidents are typically difficult to mitigate. The harm is inflicted essentially at the moment that a ransomware program manages to infect a computer. There are few later-stage monetization steps that criminals have to clear beyond that, offering correspondingly fewer opportunities for defensive intervention. By contrast, the DigiNotar compromise in some ways resembled a traditional financial cybercrime in that the generation of rogue certificates was only the first step in a larger espionage scheme that required several more stages before the perpetrators could actually access the contents of Iranian users' Google accounts. These additional stages, the DNS cache poisoning and redirection of users to fraudulent Google web pages signed by the rogue certificates, involved some powerful centralized parties, such as the DNS operators and browser manufacturers, and provided several additional opportunities for defensive intervention beyond the technical compromise of DigiNotar's own network. As with the financially motivated TJX breach, it was exactly those later stages that led to the compromise eventually being detected and addressed. The lessons of both financially motivated and espionage cybersecurity incidents echo each other in this regard. They indicate that there are many opportunities to mitigate incidents that require more than just the technical compromise of a computer system or exfiltration of stolen data. The greatest opportunities for defensive intervention are when the perpetrators, in order to be successful in their ultimate aims, have to act on that illicit access or stolen data in some way, whether by selling it, using it to perpetrate fraud, or for surveillance. Regardless of whether those actions are aimed at financial profit or espionage, the bottleneck attack stages that afford defenders a strategic advantage over attackers often occur when perpetrators' attempts to carry out those final stages of an incident, following an initial technical compromise, can be monitored, mitigated, or controlled by a relatively small number of powerful centralized stakeholders. This is more often the case with financially motivated incidents than espionage-driven ones, but there are exceptions. The least successful espionage efforts, like DigiNotar, resemble financially motivated cybercrimes in that they involve a set of powerful intermediary stakeholders, while the most successful financial cybercrimes, like CryptoLocker, eliminate intermediaries as much as possible, and in doing so, mirror the model of many espionage incidents. Part 3. Lessons from Online Acts of Public Humiliation. 8. Operation Stop House. The Spam House Denial of Service Attacks. Many cybercrimes are motivated by money, others by economic or political espionage missions, and all of these can be damaging and embarrassing for the victims in different ways. But perhaps the most flagrant and vituperative cybersecurity incidents are those perpetrated with the express purpose of publicly humiliating the victims. Attackers who are out to gain something, be it money or valuable information, have some stake in keeping their actions relatively under wraps and their victims relatively solvent, at least until they get what they want. But if the perpetrators of a breach are just out to publicly shame their victim and wreak as much havoc as possible, then they have less to lose from exposure or attention, since that is often exactly what they most want. Furthermore, there are relatively few opportunities to interrupt them, both because there may not necessarily be stolen money or information flowing back to the perpetrators in such cases, and because what they want is often malleable, since their mission can be adapted to whatever access or information they can get their hands on. Sometimes they're not even trying to obtain any proprietary information or access, just making use of resources that are publicly available online. That was the case in March 2013, when the Dutch hosting company Cyberbunker decided to exact its revenge on the Spam House Project, a non-profit organization that compiles and distributes lists of DNS servers, IP addresses, and domains known to be used by spammers so that Internet service providers can block them. Spam House also maintains a ranking of the world's worst spammers, complete with photographs and biographical information, as well as a register of known spam operations, ROXO, database, intended to help other organizations identify and block spammers. Cyberbunker bills itself as an anything-goes type of service provider, advertising its willingness to host any and all content and websites, except those featuring child pornography and terrorism-related material. This sort of lenient approach to hosting illegal or suspect content for customers is also sometimes referred to as bulletproof hosting. Because of its comparatively lax standards for customers, Cyberbunker attracts a large number of websites and customers who engage in the kinds of business that other service providers might be less willing to put up with. People who send large volumes of online spam, for instance, or provide pirated movies and music, or distribute malware. For instance, the Pirate Bay, a peer-to-peer file-sharing service notorious for its copyright-infringing content, was a Cyberbunker customer until a court in Hamburg ordered Cyberbunker to terminate their connection in 2010. The injunction against providing online access to the Pirate Bay was not Cyberbunker's only run-in with the law. In 2002, when a fire broke out in the bunker in the Netherlands, where Cyberbunker was based at the time, police discovered an MDMA lab operating in the building. Outspoken Cyberbunker spokesman Sven Olaf Kampreis later dismissed the incident, explaining, "That was a Chinese triad gang renting a room." Cyberbunker's embrace of questionable customers and their associated shady online businesses made it a natural target for Spam House, an organization devoted to fighting spam and cybercrime by helping companies figure out whose traffic they should block from reaching their customers. Founded in 1998, Spam House maintains several popular blacklists that are used widely by service providers, companies, and governments all over the world to help block spam and other malicious online activity. Because its core business is blocking not individual spammers, but the servers, service providers, and IP addresses they use, Spam House by design targets not just criminals and spammers, but the online infrastructure they rely on to deliver traffic to their victims. In fact, the term Spam House is intended to refer not to the spammers themselves, but rather to the service providers and online hosts who house them and provide them with the connectivity and resources they need to send spam, service providers like Cyberbunker. So, in March 2013, presumably after witnessing an influx of bad behavior from Cyberbunker's customers, Spam House blacklisted the company. This meant that all of the thousands of organizations that relied on Spam House's blacklists stopped accepting emails and other online traffic from many Cyberbunker customers. The blacklisting essentially cut off Cyberbunker's servers from much of the Internet, rendering their service largely worthless to their customers. Then on March 18, 2013, Spam House began experiencing an unusually large volume of traffic, around 10 gigabytes per second, to their website. The traffic saturated the organization's Internet connection, taking their site offline. The next day, Spam House hired security firm Cloudflare to help mitigate the massive distributed denial of service, DDoS, attacks they were facing. A DDoS attack involves using a bot comprised of many infected machines, often distributed across the entire world, to bombard a victim with so much online traffic that they cannot keep their systems up and running. The Spam House attacks were apparently motivated neither by espionage nor financial theft, but instead intended as retaliation against the organization for blacklisting Cyberbunker. It was part of a revenge operation dubbed Stop House that involved representatives from Cyberbunker as well as other companies that had been blacklisted by Spam House. A denial of service attack is, by design, very different from a data breach, so the lines of defense implemented by Spam House and Cloudflare in this case operated very differently from those used to mitigate espionage and fraud efforts, since there were no data exfiltration or financial theft stages to interrupt. Indeed, there was no access to sensitive information or proprietary systems at all. Instead, defensive efforts had to be pushed up to the very earliest stages of the incident because there were no later stages to fall back on. The damage to Spam House was done almost in the same instant that communication with their public-facing web servers was initiated. Not all public humiliation incidents are denial-of-service attacks. Tampering or deleting data and defacement or redirection of a website might also be driven by similar motives. Moreover, not all denial-of-service attacks are intended solely to wreak havoc. Occasionally, they are used for financial gain as a means of extorting money from victims. Still, denial-of-service attacks offer a useful model for thinking about how to defend against attacks that essentially begin and end with harm, rather than building to it through a series of spread-out intermediate steps. Because the victims themselves have so little ability to defend against these types of incidents, DDoS attacks put particular pressure on Internet service providers, ISPs, to assume more defensive responsibilities. Like other third-party defenders who do not directly bear the costs of security incidents, however, it is not clear that ISPs have any incentive to assume responsibility for defending against these types of attacks. This lack of motivation on the part of the defenders best equipped to address these threats adds to the challenge of defending against security incidents that are intended only to humiliate, inconvenience, or disrupt targets, rather than to extract their money or sensitive information. Not only are there fewer steps involved in accomplishing this kind of harm, and therefore fewer opportunities for defensive intervention, there are also fewer intermediaries who can help. Finally, payback. One of the reasons that tracing the full timeline of cybersecurity incidents is often challenging is that frequently neither the victims nor the perpetrators want to reveal much about what happened. The victims worry that providing too much information about an incident could invite lawsuits and negative press coverage, and maybe even offer other potential adversaries hints about what kinds of tactics can be used against them. The perpetrators, meanwhile, worry about criminal charges and not being able to reuse their same attack strategies if they announce to everyone what those strategies are. In general, incidents motivated by a desire to publicly humiliate the victims tend to garner more publicity than many other kinds of security incidents, since attracting attention is often part of the point. The perpetrators want people to know what they have done as part of shaming the victim. Still, the 2013 DDoS attacks directed at Spamhaus offer an unusual degree of transparency on both sides, thanks to a series of blog posts written by Cloudflare outlining the defensive strategy, as well as extensive Skype and IRC chat transcripts of conversations among the Stophaus co-conspirators from March 17 through March 25, 2013, giving insight into the attackers' perspectives and aims. The chat transcripts were released more than 3 years after the attacks by security blogger Brian Krebs, who presumably received them from someone in the chat. Anyone could join the conversation with the IRC channel name Stophaus and the group password Fuck Linford, a reference to Spamhaus's founder Steve Linford. Putting together Cloudflare's account of defending against the attacks with the real-time conversations among the attackers offers a window into the tools at the disposal of both sides and the week-long back and forth between defense and offense as both groups tried to adapt to each other's tactics and outlast the other. The chat logs begin on March 17, 2013, when a group of disgruntled Spamhaus critics congregated in a chat room to consider options for taking down Spamhaus once and for all. The participants included, among others, Campuis of Cyberbunker, under the username HRH Prince Sven Olaf von Cyberbunker-Campuis, MP. Andrew Jacob Stevens, username E.Dataking, a spamware seller who had been listed in the Spamhaus Roxo, Register of Known Spam Operations. Sean Nolan McDonough, username Narco, a British teenager who later pleaded guilty to coordinating the attacks. And Yuri Bogdanov, username Yuri, the owner of a Russian hosting company used by many spammers, and a former member of the Russian business network cybercrime organization. Over the course of the chat, the participants laid out a litany of reasons they wanted to exact revenge on Spamhaus, most of them related to Spamhaus blocking their services at some point by adding them to the widely used Spamhaus block list, SBL, or pressuring the companies that provided internet service and server space to their companies to drop them as customers or risk being added to the SBL themselves. One chat member, Alex Optic, who hosted a Russian bulletproof hosting company, i.e. a hosting company with no rules or restrictions on what type of content its customers could post, explained his hatred for Spamhaus. Alex Optic. Man from Slovakia was providing to me servers too, for Spamhaus, nearby 3 to 4 months, but Spamhaus pressed him filtering important subnets, and he had to stop working with me. But he is good man, made a refund to me for unused time. Pressuring companies that provide server space, domain names, and connectivity to spammers to drop them as customers is, of course, exactly what Spamhaus aims to do by compiling its block lists. If Slovakian servers are being used to spew spam, then Spamhaus can add the addresses of those servers to its block lists. And when their owner finds that some of his traffic has been blocked and goes to Spamhaus to ask them to unblock him, they will tell him he first has to get rid of the customers who are sending spam, in this case, Optic. It's a model for policing the Internet that is based on holding every company responsible for what their customers do, regardless of whether or not they themselves are directly responsible for the behavior that got them blocked. Given how hard it is to definitively identify, much less prosecute, spammers online, it's an approach that makes a lot of economic sense. Trying to cut spammers off from infrastructure and resources by forcing the companies that sell Internet service, web hosting, and domain names to drop them as customers. On the other hand, holding companies responsible for the actions of their customers and users can cause a lot of headaches for those companies, since it often means that many of their customers are blocked due to the misbehavior of just one person or a handful of people. The outcry from other legitimate customers is what Spamhaus relies on to pressure those companies to take the steps needed to remove themselves from the block list. But what to Spamhaus and its supporters seemed like a logical way to leverage the design of the Internet, forcing infrastructural intermediaries to police the behavior of their customers and cut off spammers' resources, looked to Campris and his co-conspirators like bullying and censorship. Stevens also used the chat to discuss his grievances with Spamhaus, particularly a time they blocked a registrar that had sold Stevens a new domain name, causing the registrar to suspend the domain. Registrars are companies that sell domain names to individuals and companies. Data King. Spamhaus attacked Moniker for hosting my sites. The most damage they ever did was when they got one registrar to suspend the domain, and then they allowed me to transfer it out to another registrar, applying the 90-day wait from ICANN, and then attacking the new registrar to cause a 90-day loss of site. By the time the 90 days was up, the site has lost its momentum. Finally, payback. Shutting or slowing down the domains of spammers is another example of exactly what Spamhaus aims to do, but that doesn't make it any less objectionable to spammers. One of the most striking things about the Spamhaus attackers, in fact, is how deeply they believed they were in the right and that Spamhaus was the real villain, censoring the internet and coercing companies into blocking anyone they deemed troublesome. There was surprisingly little awareness among the conspirators that their support of illegal activities was in any way a justification for Spamhouse's actions. Consider this exchange between McDonough and Stevens. Narco. I think Spamhouse wrote to my payment processor. Has it happened before? An IP address started to browse my site. Assigned to 2Checkout Incorporated. Now my merchant account is put into a review status. E-Data King. What have you done illegal on 2Checkout? Anything? Narco. No. Well, I sell hosting for illegal sites. In spite of, or perhaps because of, their shady lines of work, the conspirators were surprisingly ambivalent about the possibility that what they were doing in attacking Spamhouse was illegal and might lead to encounters with law enforcement. They chatted, half serious, half joking, about moving to Cambodia, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, or Russia to evade the police, debating the relative merits of different countries and which ones do and do not extradite to the United States. Romania was vetoed on those grounds. At various moments during the attacks, they posted to social media channels about the attacks using their real names, but then occasionally panicked when other users posted screenshots showing their involvement. At the same time, they were quick to dismiss the capabilities of law enforcement based on past experiences. McDonough told his co-conspirators that UK police are useless, because when he hosted phishing sites that were reported to the authorities, they did nothing. At least one early participant in the chat seemed to take seriously from the outset the possibility that the planned attacks might have repercussions for the perpetrators. Marcel Edler, of the German hosting company Optimate-Server, chose not to become involved in Operation Stophouse, writing in the chat on the evening of March 17, "Okay, guys, yes, I sold some IP space and servers for you guys in past, and had some big problems with Spamhouse, but all of them is solved now. I don't like Spamhouse, yes, but with German law I cannot help you, and will quit this channel here. I am at Skype with my real name, and you know my website. When anyone is from FBI or police, I will get big trouble. So I hope you understand me that I cannot work with you on that project." Less than an hour later, Campuis chimed in, "So, time to kill Spamhouse, LOL," and the group launched its first barrage of traffic at Spamhouse. As packets began to bombard the Spamhouse servers, the attackers viewed the whole operation as a richly deserved act of retribution. As much as they are proud of themselves when someone else loses their connectivity, it is quite a grand show to see it happen to them, for sure, Stevens said in the chat with satisfaction. Reflection Attack. Spamhouse first contacted Cloudflare on March 18, and the attacks quickly escalated the next day, after Spamhouse hired Cloudflare to help them combat the flood of online traffic swamping its servers. On March 19, soon after Cloudflare got involved, Campuis observed, "Fuck, they're back up." Indeed, Cloudflare used its 23 data centers to absorb and filter the DDoS traffic by redirecting all of the online traffic intended for Spamhouse's servers to one of its own data centers, and then passing on to Spamhouse only the traffic that appeared to be legitimate. This required being able to distinguish between the malicious DDoS traffic and legitimate requests to Spamhouse's servers, a distinction that is not always clear when dealing with denial-of-service attacks routed through a large number of compromised machines. However, the techniques for perpetrating the largest such attacks are usually the ones that make it easiest to detect and filter malicious traffic. There are multiple ways to launch a DDoS attack and flood a target's servers with traffic. Perhaps the most common strategy is to use a botnet, a network of many compromised machines that can be controlled by whoever infected them, and simply instruct all the infected machines that comprise the bot to bombard a particular website or server with traffic by continually trying to connect to that server. In these cases, it can be very difficult to distinguish between the malicious and legitimate traffic until it is possible to identify which machines have been compromised, for instance, by observing which ones are making unusually large numbers of requests. DDoS attacks that take this approach can reach a significant scale, but they are limited in size by how large and powerful the perpetrator's botnet is. These types of DDoS attacks can therefore be expensive to launch, requiring perpetrators to rent out extremely large botnets if they wish to incapacitate powerful targets with substantial bandwidth for incoming traffic. The Stophouse conspirators did use bots to bolster their attacks on Spamhaus, recruiting friends and acquaintances to direct traffic and bot power at Spamhaus's servers. McDonough, for instance, told the group at one point, "I have a friend with a small botnet. I asked him to contribute. My friend is in Saudi Arabia. He has bots in Arab regions. We'll provide some diversity to the attack. If you know anyone with botnet, ask them to help too." The geographic diversity of botnets is valuable because it makes it harder for the defenders, in this case Cloudflare, to profile the attack traffic and differentiate it from the legitimate traffic trying to reach Spamhaus. If all of the malicious traffic is coming from one group of machines or one specific region, that makes it easier to filter and block. If, on the other hand, it's coming from machines all over the world operated by different bot masters, that makes the filtering trickier. But merely harnessing the processing power of the bots operated by their friends and having all of the infected machines in those bots directly bombard Spamhaus's servers with connection requests would not have enabled the Stophouse conspirators to launch an attack as massive and crippling as they wanted. So instead of using their bots to directly bombard Spamhaus with connection requests, the conspirators used what is called a DNS reflection attack, a variation on the traditional DDoS attack. The DNS, or Domain Name System, is the same infrastructure that had to be compromised to make use of the rogue DigiNotar certificates. It's the Internet's address book, the set of servers that help machines translate URLs like www.spamhaus.org into numeric IP addresses like 192.42.118.104. In order to make that translation, a computer trying to connect to a specific website or server will send a query to a DNS server, asking it for more information about the particular URL or web address. The DNS server will look up the information for that address, called a DNS record, and then send it back to the machine that asked for it. A DNS reflection attack takes advantage of the traffic that DNS servers send directly to machines to help them complete connections online by supplying them with DNS records. To exploit these DNS records, the Stophouse conspirators used their bots to issue queries to DNS servers asking for the records associated with certain sites. These queries appeared to be from Spamhaus machines asking for information about web addresses. The queries weren't actually coming from Spamhaus. They were coming from the machines in the bots that Stophouse controlled, but the conspirators forged their originating IP addresses to look like the requests were actually sent by Spamhaus's servers. Only some DNS resolvers are susceptible to this type of trickery, called open DNS resolvers, They respond to queries from any machine at all, regardless of who its owner is. A DNS resolver is another name for a DNS server that responds to queries about the IP addresses for certain domain names. This process of translating a domain name into an IP address is sometimes referred to as resolving a domain name. Other DNS resolvers will only respond to queries from machines on their own network that they can associate with particular users, making it impossible to do the kind of impersonation that the Stophouse conspirators relied on. Unfortunately for Spamhaus, at the time of the attack in 2013, there were some 21.7 million open DNS resolvers operating online, providing the attackers with ample opportunities for manufacturing DNS reflection traffic. From an attacker's perspective, there are two important benefits of DNS reflection-based DDoS attacks over the simpler approach of using infected machines to directly bombard a target like Spamhaus. The first is that the source of the attacks, i.e. which machines specifically are launching them, is trickier for the victims to pin down, since the bombardment of unwanted packets directed at the victim is coming from open DNS resolvers rather than individual compromised machines. The victim and law enforcement has no easy way to identify which machines are infected and need to be cleaned, or how to trace the attackers back through the computers that comprise their bot. The Stophouse crew was particularly conscious of this after Cloudflare got involved in defending against the attack. At one point in the chat, Russian web host Vitaly Boyko, alias Kali, warns McDonough that Cloudflare may be able to trace the attacks back to him. Kali: but you know that they can find the source of the attack also. Narco: with DNS reflection? Kali: ah, it is DNS reflection, uppercase D. Narco: yes. The other advantage of a DNS reflection attack was that it allowed McDonough to direct considerably more traffic at Spamhaus than would have been possible just using the bots he had at his disposal. The infected machines that made up those bots could each only send a certain amount of traffic, so McDonough amplified that traffic by having the bots request very large DNS records called zone files, which contain lots of information about a domain beyond just its IP address. At McDonough's command, the infected machines would send repeated requests for zone files to open DNS resolvers and forge the source IP addresses of these requests so they looked like they came from Spamhaus. Each of these requests or queries was relatively small, about 36 bytes, so the infected machines could send lots of them. But the DNS server's responses containing the requested zone files with lots of detailed information about a given domain were much larger, around 3,000 bytes, or nearly 100 times the size of the initial query. And the DNS resolvers sent these 3 kilobyte files to Spamhaus, not to the actual machines that generated the queries, because of the spoofed source IP addresses. Using these methods, the attackers were able to generate up to about 90 gigabytes per second of traffic directed at Spamhaus, much more than they would have been able to create using only the compromised machines, without the DNS amplification factor of 100. Cloudflare CEO Matthew Prince explained, unlike traditional botnets, which could only generate limited traffic because of the modest internet connections and home PCs they typically run on, these open resolvers are typically running on big servers with fat pipes. They are like bazookas. Playing defense. Despite the record-setting levels of traffic that Stophouse managed to direct at Spamhaus, Cloudflare was largely able to mitigate the DDoS and keep Spamhaus's servers up and running. McDonough was astonished. "I don't understand this," he wrote in the group chat on March 19. "How can Cloudflare take 100 gigabytes per second, and latency is not even increased by 1 millisecond? Relying on DNS reflection traffic for a DDoS attack changes the defensive landscape, and not just because of the potential size of the attack. In a more traditional DDoS attack that does not make use of DNS reflection traffic, there are relatively few defensive options. The target can filter traffic it receives, or hire someone else like Cloudflare to do it for them, and try to identify malicious packets by detecting high-volume senders or suspicious patterns. Alternatively, the owners of the compromised machines sending that malicious traffic may notice or be informed of the large volume of outbound traffic and patch their systems. Moving earlier up the attack chain, it may be possible to go after the actors renting out botnets, but much of the defensive responsibility falls on the targets and occasionally on the machines directly bombarding them with traffic. By introducing DNS resolvers as an intermediary for sending that traffic, attackers can greatly increase the volume of such attacks, but they also create a new defensive opportunity for the DNS operators who run these resolvers. These operators can restrict which queries their DNS resolvers respond to, so that queries from unknown or unauthorized machines are ignored, and the resolvers are no longer open. DNS operators can also rate limit their resolvers, rather than closing them completely to the public, so that they only respond to a set number of queries in a certain time period, and therefore cannot be used to generate as much traffic directed at a single server. Following the Spamhaus attacks, the Open Resolver project publicly released a list of millions of open resolvers online in hopes of pressuring their operators to shut them down or further restrict them, highlighting the potential power of this group of intermediaries. Besides introducing a new class of defensive intermediaries in the form of the DNS operators, DDoS amplification attacks also make it easier for targets and companies like Cloudflare to distinguish between malicious and non-malicious traffic. In standard DDoS attacks, both types of traffic may look very similar, like people trying to connect to a particular website or server. But in DNS amplification attacks, the malicious traffic is likely to be of a very specific type, large DNS records, that can be recognized and dropped without affecting legitimate users. Another type of attack traffic involved in the DDoS attack directed at Spamhaus was generated by an ACK, acknowledgement, reflection attack, in which the compromised machines initiated TCP sessions, ostensibly from a Spamhaus IP address, and the receiving servers therefore responded to Spamhaus with an ACK connection, acknowledging receipt of the session initiation. TCP, or Transmission Control Protocol, is a protocol for establishing a network connection between two computers so that they can communicate with each other. This type of DDoS does not have the amplification effect afforded by DNS reflection, but still helps with identifying malicious traffic, since targets can simply drop all unmatched ACKs that they know they did not request. Both DNS amplification and ACK reflection attacks rely on the ability of senders to spoof the originating IP address of any traffic they send. If the attackers couldn't make it look like the DNS queries and TCP session initiation requests had come from Spamhaus, then these methods would be of no use. So another possible defensive approach is to target this spoofing of sender IP addresses by ingress filtering, or forcing routers to check source IP addresses of packets they receive. Strangely, when Cloudflare went public with a blog post detailing how the attacks had been perpetrated, in particular the AC and DNS reflection traffic, the attackers were upset that their techniques had been revealed. On March 20, McDonough wrote to the group chat, with no apparent irony, "Narco. They wrote about my AC reflection. Ellipsis. They need to not write information like this. They're just going to give people the information to do more attacks." McDonough was so certain that he is in the right in perpetrating this attack that he appears to have been utterly unaware of the irony of his worrying about other people perpetrating exactly the type of attack he was engaged in launching against Spamhaus. Leveraging their capacity to collect and filter enormous volumes of traffic, Cloudflare helped Spamhaus mitigate the attacks for 2 days, until the DDoS attacks appeared to cease on March 21. On March 22, the attacks resumed, but they were no longer directed at Spamhaus. Instead, the attackers shifted their focus to the service providers and interconnection facilities that Cloudflare used to connect to the Internet. This change in strategy to try to knock Cloudflare offline pushed the defensive responsibilities upstream, forcing Cloudflare's bandwidth providers to filter traffic and, reportedly, causing some collateral congestion for other users so that people began noticing Internet performance problems more broadly. There are 2 basic models for defending against DDoS attacks. The first is to target the early stages of an attack by preventing the perpetrators from generating large volumes of traffic. This might mean trying to break out botnets, disinfect compromised machines, or rate limit how much traffic an individual machine or group of machines can send to a particular destination. The second type of defense, aimed at a later stage of DDoS attacks when traffic is directed at a particular target, aims to prevent those large volumes of traffic from reaching or incapacitating their targets. This was the role Cloudflare played in the attacks on Spamhaus by absorbing the malicious traffic and filtering it before it reached Spamhaus's servers. It's a model built on the idea that protecting themselves against certain types of online harm is something victims don't always have the visibility or resources to do themselves, and must therefore rely on intermediaries, like Cloudflare, to do by inserting their infrastructure in between the attackers and their targets. Even without deliberately redirecting incoming traffic through a company like Cloudflare, there are already intermediaries between DDoS attackers and their victims, namely the service providers who carry online traffic across the Internet. Service providers are equipped with greater visibility into online traffic patterns than any other group of intermediaries, since they can track where that traffic is coming from and going to across millions of machines. This gives them a unique ability to identify malicious traffic and botnets when they see large groups of machines all being contacted by the same command and control servers at regular intervals, or all bombarding the same target with large volumes of traffic. Service providers also have the power to decide whether that traffic should be dropped or delivered to its intended recipients. Furthermore, the major Tier 1 service providers, which carry the bulk of online traffic, are relatively concentrated in a handful of large companies, making them significantly easier to regulate than, for instance, the thousands of dispersed DNS operators or millions of owners of compromised machines. While DNS operators and the owners of compromised machines can in theory assist with defending against DDoS attacks, they have little visibility into when it is necessary and even less incentive to bother. Because of service providers' unique defensive capabilities and relative market concentration, some governments have targeted them as the intermediaries best equipped to defend against denial-of-service attacks, and bots more generally. In both the United States and Australia, regulators have helped develop voluntary codes of conduct for service providers, recommending measures that could help mitigate bots by taking advantage of service providers' unparalleled visibility into malicious traffic patterns and ability to deliver, or not deliver, packets to their intended destination. Like other third-party defenders who do not directly bear the costs of security incidents, however, service providers do not necessarily have strong incentives to assume these voluntary defensive responsibilities. In the Spamhaus case, law enforcement also ended up playing a defensive role. Compuis and McDonough were both later arrested. But this is often a tricky line of defense for a class of attack that rarely leaves a clear money trail or beneficiary. Successful law enforcement intervention was possible in the Spamhaus case, partly because Cyberbunker was so outspoken in assuming responsibility for the attacks. Compuis posted on Facebook and Twitter about the attacks while they were happening, and publicly acknowledged in an interview with the New York Times that Cyberbunker was using the DDoS attacks to punish Spamhaus for abusing their influence. McDonough, who was a minor when he launched the attacks, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to only 240 hours of community service on the grounds that he suffered from severe mental illness. Compuis, who was arrested in Spain in April 2013 and later extradited to the Netherlands, was sentenced to 240 days in jail in November 2016, but had already spent 55 days in jail after being extradited, and the remaining 185 days of his sentence were suspended by the judge. Linford later expressed disappointment in the light sentence in an email to Krebs, writing, "We had hoped for a longer jail sentence to send the message that organizing and conducting DDoS attacks is a crime not acceptable to law courts or society. However, the ease with which Compuis was arrested and extradited, and the 2 months already served in jail, will hopefully have delivered the message to him that there is no escape from the law should he attempt any attacks in the future."